Hello. Well, apparently Lisa Nandy, who is one of the contenders for the Labour leadership after Jeremy Corbyn steps down, if he ever does, Lisa Nandy has called for the word empire to be removed from the honours system because it alienates people who were oppressed by Britain in the past. You know, sort of one-upmanship on doing down the British people, who I might say have just freed themselves from the European Union after a titanic struggle and who have shown a considerable amount of bravery. Let's face it, in other societies there would have been riots on the streets in situations as contentious as the one we've seen over the past few months. But there were no riots on the streets in Britain. There were no policemen punching firemen. There were no people sniping from windows. There were some marches, and they were by and large, at least from the Brexiteers, quiet, orderly, and civilised. So we have here a situation of which we can be very proud, because Britain has gone through an immense and terrific revolution, the reverberations of which are going to, they're going to go across the world, especially across Europe. As I think it was Boris Johnson who said, Britain is leading the way again. And it will have its effect on America too. And this is something to be intensely proud of. And all we have from Lisa Nandy, leadership contender for the treacherous Labour Party, is to talk about taking the word empire out of an order, an honour given by the Queen to people who have distinguished themselves in some way or another.
Let's start with you, Johnsy. You turned down an MBE because of this issue. Explain why.
Well, I think it's going to be really hard to sleep at night to wear something that says the member of the British Empire on my chest as a result of what happened in the Empire.
What happened in the Empire, whoever you are, Johnsy something or other. I'm afraid I've covered his name. I'll put it in the description. This chap, probably, I'm assuming he came from the West Indies. He could have come from Nigeria, I suppose. But I'm assuming he's a West Indian of a West Indian parentage or grandparentage. He's here sitting in a nicely air-conditioned television studio, speaking English, no doubt using the British Health Service, paying taxes to Britain, and participating in a British society which, in general, lets him walk the streets in relative safety and gives him recourse to legal support if he finds his rights are being contravened in some way. This is what the British Empire did. And he's complaining about this.
The slavery, for example, partition in India.
Just a minute. Partition in India. That's because the Muslims and the Hindus couldn't get on with each other. They wanted partition. It wasn't the British who imposed partition on them. They divided things up because the two groups couldn't stand the sight of each other. And indeed, after the British left, that was the time when there was the most horrendous murders and vicious fighting in the entire subcontinent. And that wasn't the British responsibility.
Many examples of this real horrible activity that happened. Kenya, for example, there's lots of abuses, sexual abuse. So I just didn't want to put my...
Yeah, some soldiers did act badly in Kenya, for sure. Yeah, like this is the story of the British Empire, isn't it?
Do you accept that the Empire did some good things? I mean, people argue, and I'm sure Toby will, education, infrastructure, language, and so on, that it wasn't all bad? Or do you think the whole thing was awful?
Well, I think a lot of it was incidental. I think that, roads and trains is more about getting all of the product out of the country so it can go to Europe.
Yeah, that's probably true, but they left them there.
So I think that it's tricky to say that there were loads of good things about the empire. I think we need a bit more of a balance.
It's not tricky at all.
So the bad outweighs the good. And actually, in the end, it's...
I don't know how Piers Morgan is keeping his cool here. I think I'd have probably reached across the table and tried to slap that guy there. Anyway, let's see what this fella has to say.
On a title... Excellence clearly has no potentially offensive or inflammatory context to it. Does it matter if we change from empire to excellence?
Well, the word excellence is already in the order of the British Empire. It's the most excellent, is the first part of it. I think, of course, the legacy of empire is a mixed one. But let's not pretend it is just an unbroken litany of exploitation and shame. I mean, take slavery, for instance. Britain's participation in the transatlantic slave trade is certainly a stain on our history, but let's not pretend the British invented slavery. Over 1 million Europeans were bought and sold in the slave markets of North Africa between the 16th century and the mid-18th century. The British Empire abolished slavery in 1807.
This guy, Toby, whoever he is, that's the wrong way of approaching this, in my opinion. He's talking about the things, he's already, backed off. He's been wrong-footed. He's got these two guys on either side of him, both of whom are unsympathetic to Britain. The other guy, I know that guy, he's called Cahinder Andrews, and he has form. I've seen stuff of his before, usually in The Guardian, by the way. No surprise. But this guy is trying to come up with a list of all the things that Britain did well. Well, all he has to say is the British Empire was the best at a time when other empires were really destroying people. The Ottoman Empire, for instance, had an economic system based on slavery. But those guys, Cahinder Andrews and this other fellow, whatever he's called, they wouldn't be here today if they had been enslaved in the Ottoman Empire. Why? Because when male slaves were bought in the Ottoman Empire, they were castrated. There were no descendants. And that's why there are no descendants of Turkish slaves sitting in air-conditioned studios in Turkey. You will not notice that many black people in Turkey, even though there were plenty of black people being enslaved in the Ottoman Empire. No, because in Turkey, when you got black slaves, they were, as I said, the men were castrated. The women were very rarely bred from. They were usually just used as workhorses. And the female slaves that were used for, for sex and then who did have children, they were from further north, the Caucasus, Greece, Bulgaria, Albania, because the Ottomans had a taste for blonde women.
Abolition of Slavery Act, making slavery illegal across the British Empire, and over 1,600 British servicemen died.
You're shaking your head.
He's shaking his head.
As part of the West African Squadron in the Royal Navy.
What is the truth?
I mean, no, the British Empire abolished the slave trade in 1807, did not abolish slavery in its own until 1838, carried on buying slave-produced cotton until 1888.
No, they didn't. The Americans did. And the British tried to stop them. They patrolled the high seas at expense to themselves to stop as much of the slave trade as they could, the transatlantic slave trade. And then they went to the Ottoman Empire and told them they had to stop the slave trade, a suggestion which was met with great amusement and some hilarity from the Ottoman ambassador to whom they spoke.
The idea, this is the whole problem here. The way we remember this history is so bad that we actually think we can find some comfort in a system which killed tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of people.
No, it didn't.
Down an MBE.
No, it did not. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions. This is nonsense.
Because of this issue. Explain why.
Well, I think it's going to be really hard to sleep at night to wear something that says the member of the British
servicemen die.
Killed tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of people, rape, murder, torture, famine. The idea that in the 21st century we're even having this discussion,
And rape, murder and torture didn't happen anywhere else, of course. It was the condition of the world, but there was less of it in the British Empire, for sure.
Whiteness is a psychosis. You can't have a...
Whiteness is a psychosis. Let's just have a look at what psychosis is. Hang on a minute. I can't find it now. However, I'll put a screenshot up about psychosis. A psychosis is when you have no sense of reality. That's what a psychosis is. And being white is not a psychosis. It's a fact.
Like an actual reasonable discussion, because this is the kind of thing...
Well, but the trouble is, you say you can't have a reasonable discussion.
But
you say
call whiteness a psychosis.
Whiteness is a psychosis.
Do you
You're
think...
basically calling all white people nuts.
No.
Why is Piers being so reasonable about this? I mean, this man has a psychosis. Maybe he's just being kind to somebody he considers maybe a little, well, off his rocker.
Nope, that's not what I said.
What is it? Whiteness is a psychosis.
The discourse around whiteness, which underpins all...
Oh, hang on a minute.
The trouble is, you say you can't have a reasonable discussion.
Just a minute.
Whiteness is a psychosis. You're basically calling all white people...
He just said, let's find it again.
The idea that in the 21st century we're even having this discussion, this whiteness is a psychosis.
All right, just a minute. Whiteness is a psychosis. That's what he's saying. Yeah? Now...
have like an actual reasonable discussion, because this is the kind of thing...
Well, but the trouble is, you say you can't have a reasonable discussion.
But you call whiteness a psychosis.
Whiteness is a psychosis. You're basically calling all white people nuts.
No, that is not. Nope, that's not what I said.
That's not what he said.
I said the discourse around whiteness, which underpins all of this and all these conversations we're having, is totally irrational.
Right. He's saying the discourse around whiteness is irrational. That's not the same thing, and that's not what he said. But he started off by saying whiteness was a psychosis, because that gave him punch. It didn't matter if it didn't mean anything. The problem is there are young black people who are watching this, who are just going to hear that whiteness is a psychosis, and it's going to give them a feeling of grievance. Well, the more impressionable they are anyway, maybe the younger ones. And this is just giving people the wrong idea. It is the wrong idea. And I don't understand why those two interviewers are being so polite to this slanderous little toad.
It's deluded. It has no basis in fact or reality. And the whole purpose of it is to...
What do you mean, no basis in factual reality?
Perpetuate this continued...
All right, Toby Young, you're a psychotic because you're white.
That's not what I said.
You implied
But
it.
That sounds racist.
Can you just explain, because that does sound...
He said it sounds racist. And yes, it is racist. If anyone had said blackness was a psychosis, everyone would have gone, you can't say that. And yet these people are sitting there and looking at this guy and trying to argue with him reasonably. You can't argue reasonably with nonsense. you're being reasonable, and this other person is spouting nonsense back. There's no way you can get any productive discussion out of something like that.
Racist. Whiteness is.
Well, it is racist.
No. So whiteness is not just for white people. There are plenty of black people, Asian people who also purport the psychosis of whiteness.
Right. So here we have a redefinition of terms. You can be black, Asian, whatever, but you're still a white psychotic if you buy into the idea that the British Empire wasn't an unrelieved disaster for all humanity. So Kanye West was considered not black because he took up with Donald Trump. And I believe there was I don't remember who he was now, a billionaire, some American businessman, inventor, something like that, who happened to be gay. And he took up with Trump, and they were saying, well, yeah, the left was saying, well, he may be sleeping with men for preference, but he's not gay really because he's with Trump.
It's about the fact that in the 21st century, 60% of British people believe that empire was a force for good. I mean, this is like saying the Nazis built motorways, so we should sell it.
So the 50% of the British people, did he say 50%? Something like that. Think that the British Empire was a force for good? You're sitting there talking English! Of course it was a bloody force for good.
This is literally an irrational...
You're comparing the British...
That's not irrational.
to Nazi Germany.
You're right. There is no comparison. The British Empire did far more harm to the world for a far more...
Yeah. Oh, for God's sake. This guy is a professor at Birmingham University, Birmingham City, I think. Why is he being given money to... Obviously, he's peddling this sort of nonsense over there in Birmingham. Why are they paying him? And you know, if they didn't pay him, he'd go on the dole. He'd go on public assistance. He would get money from the British people to keep body and soul together.
The British Empire was worse.
But what about the role that Britain, in collaboration with its overseas territories, played in defeating Nazi Germany? Had it not been for the resources and the power of the British Empire in the 1940s, Britain standing alone would not have been able to take on and defeat Nazi Germany. Surely that's something we should celebrate, not be ashamed.
Are we also forgetting that the concentration camps, where were they first trialed? In the British Empire. Are we also forgetting that the logic of race, that actually this is something which you can kill and murder and slaughter for, was practiced heavily in the British Empire?
All right, John Z.
The science that underpinned the Nazis came largely from the British Empire.
John Z.
So it's all about...
I've spoken to a lot of black people who feel...
You see, there's always an answer back. By the way, it's true. In South Africa during the Boer War, they had concentration camps. They moved the Boers into camps. The conditions were pretty terrible. It wasn't nice. There was no control at that time. There was a war going on it was a territorial war. But those people were moved not to exterminate them, although many did suffer, and I'm sure more died than should have done. Simply because the conditions were harsh and primitive. And they were done because they were enemy aliens. I'm not saying that this was good. But you can go through any country and find that. And if you look at the African countries, those guys are speaking English because an ancestor of theirs sold them, or some enemy of one of their ancestors sold them to slave traders going across to the New World. Black Africans, sold other black Africans, destroyed tribes of other black Africans. It was all over Africa at the time. You can go into any society and find that. That's not what that's not what we should be talking about. But if you look at anything and you look for the bad things, you're going to find the bad things. And the British Empire was a force for good. It dragged the world out of a primitive system. It instituted political systems that other countries emulated. For sure it was a force for good. It instituted America, which has become a beacon of hope for millions of people, which is why you've got trouble with your borders over there in the US. And I might say it had its effect on governments. Don't forget, the British were the first to institute from a royalty, a republic in the modern world. They were the ones who had the first revolution against royal arrogance. The French in their revolution, which by the way didn't go as well as the British Revolution went, they emulated that idea. All of these countries followed the British example. And you know what? After Brexit, if Johnson keeps his nerve, they will be emulating Britain again. Of course, Britain has very often been a force for good in the Western world. I'm very proud of that. And I get just furious when I hear oafs like that repellent little toad over there, talking down Britain as if it were a terrible place full of awful people who did evil things for their own advantage. And I just don't understand how Piers Morgan can keep a straight face for those guys.
There's no doubt this is a feeling that many black people in this country feel. They feel the British Empire stands for something that oppressed.
Well, they shouldn't.
Their people around the world, right?
Yeah.
And I get that. But do we have to go as far as changing the name?
You know, I don't get that. Given half a chance, every single one of those African states that the British ruled, sometimes well, sometimes badly, but all of them would have done the same thing if they'd have been in the opposite position.
Of honours? Or is there a better way of tackling this?
I think it's important to change the name because I don't see how excellence and talent, particularly within the arts, needs to be connected with empire.
I don't see why it shouldn't. I can see a case made for changing the name, actually, because there is no British Empire. But, well, it's an anachronism. It's not doing any harm either.
I don't see why that's a connection that
And
needs
if
to
the
happen.
empire doesn't exist,
I don't see why excellence shouldn't be given an honour. And if the honour happens to have that name, then so what?
or isn't it an anachronism anyway, whatever you might think about it?
But don't we have an obsession with trying to expunge episodes that we're not particularly proud of from our history by changing words, by taking down statues?
But we might not even
That's
be
sort of
expunging
Orwellian,
that
isn't it?
history. We might just be saying that is history.
Yep. It's not that the British are trying to expunge the history. People like the followers of Jeremy Corbyn are trying to expunge our history, because when you take somebody's history away, you make them more pliable. And that's all that's going on here. And these people here, this guy and the other one, Andrews, they want to do away with British history or turn it into something terrible so that it gives them, those guys, more status in a demoralised British society. Well, I won't have any of it. And I hope that enough of my fellow Britons also won't have any of it. And they don't have to be white either. There are plenty of people proud of being British as I am who are not white. What a shower. And I really don't know how Piers Morgan and the woman with him, whatever she's called. You see, I don't watch this stuff live, so I don't know the names anymore, but, Suzanne Reid, of course. I I don't know how they kept their cool in the face of these people. But actually, I think it was a bad thing they did. Because if you laughed at these idiots, it would do more good. If it was exposed what dreadful idiots they are. You don't give idiots a platform and treat them seriously. Okay. If you want to donate or contact, the information will be rolling over the Graniopteryx as I speak. Please like, subscribe and share because it does help with the algorithm. If you visit my channel on YouTube and one day discover that I've disappeared without warning, you'll still find me on BitChute or Minds. Just go to either of those platforms and do a search for Graniopteryx. If you're already watching this on BitChute or Minds, good for you. Meanwhile, if you're watching this on YouTube, remember that you must keep checking the subscribe and bell icons because occasionally they reset. Till next time.